For most of human history, nobody counted calories. Nobody tracked macros on an app, timed their meals to the minute, or agonized over whether breakfast should come before or after a workout. And yet, across deserts, mountains, jungles, and frozen coastlines, people who had access to a fraction of what we have today stayed lean, strong, and energized well into old age. The more you are, that should bother you a little. Because right now, in the most food-abundant era in human history, more people struggle with sluggish metabolism, stubborn weight, and constant fatigue than ever before. Something is missing, and it isn't willpower. What if the answer was never about eating less? What if it was about eating differently? The way people ate before processed convenience quietly rewired what we consider normal food. Long before anyone understood the words thermogenesis or insulin sensitivity, traditional cultures were already using certain plants, roots, spices, and staple foods that modern research is only now confirming actually influence how the body burns and stores fat. They didn't have lab equipment. They had generations of observation, watching which foods gave people energy in the fields, which ones kept hunters lean through brutal winters, which ones settled digestion after heavy meals, and which ones simply worked, year after year, household after household. Today, we're going to walk through 15 of those foods. Not fad diet foods, not supplement company inventions, real, old-world ingredients with a documented history of traditional use. Foods that a hunter in the Andes, a farmer in the Mediterranean, and a fisherman on the Korean coast, all independently discovered, were doing something for their bodies long before anyone could explain why. By the time we reach number 7, you'll understand why a fermented cabbage dish eaten for centuries in Korea is quietly tied to how efficiently your gut processes energy. And by the time we get to the final food on this list, the one hiding in plain sight in almost every kitchen on Earth, you'll probably wonder why nobody ever told you this before. This isn't about miracle foods. There is no single ingredient that melts fat while you sleep, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What this is about is recognizing a pattern where traditional cultures, through nothing but careful observation passed down over generations, arrived at food choices that modern biology is now able to explain at the cellular level. Ancient people were not primitive. They were observant, and what they noticed, quietly, meal after meal, might be exactly what your metabolism has been missing. Let's start with the one that traditional healers reached for whenever the body needed to be woken up. Number 1. Cayenne and chili peppers. Most people think of chili peppers as flavor, maybe a garnish, maybe something you order to prove a point at a restaurant. Historically, they were something else entirely. In Mesoamerican cultures long before European contact, chili peppers were treated as an essential part of the daily diet, used not just for taste but medicinally, believed to warm the body, aid digestion, and support circulation during long working days. Traditional Andean and Central American diets built chili into nearly every meal, and it's not a coincidence that these cultures also relied heavily on physical labor and needed sustained energy output. Here is where modern research adds the missing piece. Chili peppers contain a compound called capsaicin, the same compound responsible for their heat. Capsaicin has been studied for its effect on thermogenesis, the process by which the body generates heat and burns calories. Research suggests capsaicin may temporarily increase energy expenditure and support fat oxidation, in part by activating specific heat-sensing receptors that trigger the nervous system to slightly ramp up metabolic activity. But that is only part of the story. Capsaicin also appears to influence appetite regulation. Some studies indicate that spicy compounds may reduce hunger signals slightly, which historically would have mattered enormously. In periods of food scarcity, feeling satisfied on smaller amounts of food was a survival advantage, not a lifestyle choice. This is why the traditional use of chili peppers mattered then, and why it still matters now. In a modern world where constant snacking and oversized portions have become normalized, a compound that gently supports both metabolic rate and appetite control is far from outdated. Traditionally, chili was used fresh, dried, fermented, or ground into pastes and stirred into nearly everything. Today, the same principle applies, without needing to overwhelm your palate. A small amount of cayenne in eggs, soups, or roasted vegetables is enough to introduce capsaicin regularly, without needing to eat something painfully hot. The lesson traditional cultures understood instinctively is simple. Heat wasn't just flavor, it was function. The next food on this list works through an entirely different mechanism, one tied not to heat, but to something happening quietly in your gut. Number 2. Ginger. Ginger has been treated, for thousands of years, across Asian trade routes, less like a spice and more like medicine that happened to taste good. Traditional Chinese and Ayurvedic health systems used ginger root extensively, not for flavor first, but for its effect on digestion, circulation, and internal warmth. Maybe, the less you have, the more you are required to boast. In traditional households, ginger tea was something you gave someone whose stomach was struggling, or whose energy had crashed after a heavy meal. It wasn't reached for casually, it was reached for with intention. What makes that even more remarkable is how closely that traditional use lines up with what modern science has found. Ginger contains gingerol, a bioactive compound studied for its potential to support digestion and reduce feelings of bloating. Some research indicates gingerol may also have a mild thermogenic effect and may help regulate blood sugar response after meals, a factor closely tied to how efficiently the body manages and stores fat. There's also a quieter effect worth mentioning. Poor digestion doesn't just cause discomfort, it can slow the entire metabolic process, since a sluggish gut struggles to properly absorb and process the nutrients the body needs for energy production. Ginger's traditional role in aiding digestion may be, indirectly, one of the reasons it has stayed embedded in wellness traditions across dozens of cultures for millennia. This is a pattern we'll see again throughout this list. Foods that don't force weight loss directly, but instead remove friction from processes the body is already trying to run efficiently. Traditionally, ginger was steeped as tea, added fresh to broths, or chewed in small amounts before meals to prepare digestion. That same simplicity works today. Fresh ginger steeped in hot water, ideally before a meal rather than after, echoes exactly how it was used centuries ago. Ancient physicians didn't have blood tests. What they had was pattern recognition, refined over generations, and ginger kept passing the test. Next is a spice, so common it's overlooked entirely, and its story might be the most surprising one yet. Number 3. Turmeric. Turmeric rarely gets credit for anything beyond color. It turns curries golden, stains cutting boards, and shows up in wellness marketing so often that people stop taking it seriously. But long before it became a trend, turmeric held a central place in traditional Indian medicine, used for generations to support joint comfort, digestion, and general vitality. What traditional healers likely never fully understood, but clearly observed through outcomes, is that turmeric's primary active compound, curcumin, has notable effects on inflammation at a cellular level, and inflammation is not just a joint issue. Research increasingly links chronic low-grade inflammation to metabolic slowdown, insulin resistance, and the body's tendency to store rather than burn fat. This is where things change in how we should think about turmeric. It isn't a fat burner in the marketing sense. It's closer to a systems regulator, something that may help keep the metabolic environment functioning the way it's supposed to. Studies have examined curcumin's potential role in supporting healthy blood sugar levels and reducing markers of inflammation associated with weight gain and metabolic strain. The catch, and this is something ancient food pairings seem to solve by accident, is that curcumin is poorly absorbed on its own, which brings us to something remarkable. Traditional Indian cooking almost always paired turmeric with black pepper and a source of fat, whether ghee or oil. Modern research has since confirmed that piperine, the active compound in black pepper, can significantly increase curcumin absorption, and fat further aids its uptake since curcumin is fat-soluble. Traditional cooks weren't chasing bioavailability studies. They were pairing ingredients that simply worked well together, generation after generation, and it turns out that pairing was scientifically sound the entire time. Practically, this means turmeric on its own, sprinkled onto a salad, does very little. Turmeric, cooked into a dish with black pepper and a healthy fat, is a different story entirely. The deeper reason turmeric mattered then, and matters now, isn't dramatic. It's foundational. A body under constant inflammatory stress rarely burns fat efficiently, no matter what else you do. Speaking of black pepper's hidden role, it deserves its own spotlight next. Number 4. Black pepper. Black pepper is so common that it borders on invisible. It sits on every table, gets shaken onto food out of habit, and rarely gets a second thought. But its use goes back thousands of years, prized enough in some periods of history to function almost like currency, and traditional medicine systems across Asia used it specifically to stimulate digestion and circulation. What makes that particularly interesting is the compound responsible, piperine. We already touched on piperine's role in enhancing curcumin absorption, but its effects don't stop there. Research suggests piperine may independently influence fat metabolism by interfering with the formation of new fat cells and potentially improving how efficiently the body processes fats from food. Piperine has also been studied for its impact on thermogenesis, similar in concept to capsaicin, though through a different biological pathway. The body's ability to generate heat and burn energy isn't controlled by one single switch. It's influenced by dozens of small, layered mechanisms, and piperine appears to be one contributor among many. But here is where it gets interesting. Piperine also appears to enhance the bioavailability of multiple nutrients beyond curcumin, meaning traditional diets that used black pepper liberally may have been unintentionally maximizing the nutritional value of everything else on the plate. This is the kind of layered wisdom that's easy to miss when looking at ingredients individually, rather than as part of a traditional dietary pattern. No single spice was doing all the work. The combination was the point. Traditionally, black pepper was ground fresh rather than pre-ground, since its potency fades with time and exposure to air. That detail still holds up. Freshly cracked pepper carries meaningfully more of its active compounds than pepper that's been sitting pre-ground for months. The lesson here is subtle but important. Sometimes the most powerful food on a list isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's the one already sitting on your table, doing more work than anyone gave it credit for. If you're noticing a pattern of forgotten function hiding in ordinary kitchen staples, that pattern is about to get even more interesting. Let us know in the comments which one has surprised you the most so far, and if this kind of deep dive into traditional food wisdom is useful to you, consider subscribing, because there's a lot more of this coming. Next, we shift from spice cabinets to something traditionally brewed rather than sprinkled. Number 5. Green tea. Tea ceremonies didn't develop by accident. Across East Asian traditions, green tea wasn't just a beverage. It was structured, ritualized, and treated with a level of respect usually reserved for something with real physiological importance. Long before anyone measured antioxidant levels in a lab, traditional cultures noticed that green tea seemed to support clarity, energy, and lightness of body in a way other drinks didn't. Modern research has since identified why. Green tea is rich in catechins, particularly one called AGCG, a compound that has been studied extensively for its potential role in supporting metabolic rate and fat oxidation. Some research suggests the combination of catechins and the naturally occurring caffeine in green tea may work together to modestly increase energy expenditure, more than either compound produces alone. What makes that even more remarkable is the mechanism involved. EGCG appears to inhibit an enzyme responsible for breaking down norepinephrine, a hormone involved in fat burning. When that enzyme is inhibited, norepinephrine may remain active longer, potentially extending its fat oxidizing effects. This is a clear example of traditional intuition landing, almost precisely, on something science would only later be able to explain at the molecular level. Green tea has also been studied for its effects on gut bacteria composition, with some research indicating it may support a healthier microbial environment linked to more efficient metabolism. Why did this matter historically? In cultures where physical labor was constant and food was seasonal, anything offering sustained, clean energy without a crash was valuable beyond flavor. Green tea offered exactly that: gentle stimulation without the jittery spike associated with more concentrated caffeine sources. Traditionally prepared as loose leaf, Steeped at lower temperatures to preserve delicate compounds, green tea's preparation method actually matters. Boiling water can degrade catechins, which is part of why traditional tea ceremonies were so precise about temperature and steeping time. That precision wasn't ceremony for its own sake. It was preservation of potency, discovered through trial and repetition long before chemistry could explain it. For modern use, 2 to 3 cups of properly steeped green tea throughout the day mirrors traditional consumption patterns far more closely than a single large dose. The plant our ancestors treated with ceremony turns out to have earned every bit of that reverence. But green tea has a louder, more aggressive cousin in the world of traditional stimulating drinks, and its story is even more surprising. Number 6. Coffee. Coffee's spread across continents wasn't driven by marketing. It moved from region to region because people noticed something real. It sharpened focus, delayed fatigue, and seemed to support physical stamina during long working hours. Ethiopian highland communities are credited with some of the earliest documented uses of coffee, and from there, its reputation carried it across trade routes into the Arab world, Europe, and beyond, entirely on word of mouth and observed effect. The metabolic story behind coffee is more nuanced than most people realize. Caffeine, its primary active compound, has been studied for decades for its ability to increase metabolic rate and support fat oxidation, particularly before physical activity. Research indicates caffeine may stimulate the nervous system in a way that temporarily boosts calorie burning and enhances the mobilization of fat from storage sites to be used as fuel. But that is only part of the story. Coffee also contains chlorogenic acid, a compound studied for its potential role in slowing carbohydrate absorption and supporting healthier blood sugar responses after meals. The combination of caffeine and chlorogenic acid may be part of why coffee's effects on metabolism appear more consistent across studies than caffeine supplements taken in isolation. Here's the contrast worth sitting with. Traditional coffee, brewed simply, without the sugar-laden, cream-heavy versions common today, delivered these compounds with almost nothing working against them. Modern coffee culture has often buried a genuinely useful traditional beverage under enough sugar and syrup to cancel out any metabolic benefit and replace it with a net negative. This is the real reframe. Coffee isn't the problem people sometimes assume it is. What's been added to it is. Historically, coffee was consumed black or with minimal additions, often before physical labor, aligning almost perfectly with when caffeine's fat-oxidizing effects appear to be most useful, before exertion, not passively throughout the day. For modern use, this suggests something simple. Timing and preparation matter more than the coffee itself. A cup of black coffee before movement echoes exactly how coffee functioned in the traditions that first embraced it. The bean that conquered the world did so by actually working. The question is whether what we've turned it into still does. Now we move away from stimulating plants entirely, towards something with a much sharper history. Number 7. Apple cider vinegar. Long before refrigeration existed, vinegar was one of the primary tools cultures used to preserve food. Fermented apple vinegar in particular became a household staple across parts of Europe and the Middle East, used to pickle vegetables, preserve meats, and extend the life of a harvest through long winters. What traditional households likely didn't realize is that the fermentation process producing vinegar also creates something biologically active, acetic acid. And acetic acid has become one of the more heavily studied compounds in relation to blood sugar regulation. Several studies suggest that consuming a small amount of apple cider vinegar before or with a carbohydrate-heavy meal may help blunt the resulting blood sugar spike. This matters for metabolism because sharp blood sugar spikes trigger correspondingly sharp insulin responses, and insulin is a storage hormone. When it surges dramatically, and often, the body is being repeatedly signaled to store energy rather than burn it. What makes that even more remarkable is the historical use case. In many traditional cultures, a small glass of diluted vinegar was consumed before heavier meals, not as a diet trick, but simply as an appetite and digestion aid passed down through habit. That habit, purely by observation, may have been quietly supporting healthier blood sugar responses for generations, entirely without anyone understanding the mechanism. There's a gut health angle here too. because apple cider vinegar is fermented, unfiltered versions containing the mother retain beneficial bacterial compounds that some research links to a more favorable gut microbiome, which in turn has been connected to more efficient metabolic function. But here's the necessary caution, and it's one traditional use actually respected. Vinegar was always diluted, never consumed straight. Undiluted acetic acid can damage tooth enamel and irritate the digestive tract. Traditional preparation wasn't caution for caution's sake. It was the only way it was ever meant to be used. Practically, this means a tablespoon of raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar, diluted in a glass of water, before a carbohydrate-heavy meal, mirrors exactly how it functioned historically, minus the guesswork. The preservation liquid that kept food from spoiling may have also been quietly preserving something else: metabolic balance, one meal at a time. The next item on this list isn't a liquid or a spice. It's a fat that traditional coastal and tropical cultures trusted more than any other. Number 8. Coconut oil. For decades, dietary fat was treated as the enemy, but long before that fear took hold, tropical and coastal cultures across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands relied on coconut oil as a primary cooking fat, generation after generation. That contrast alone should raise questions. And the biological explanation is more specific than fat is fine. Coconut oil is unusually rich in medium-chain triglycerides, or MACTs, a type of fat structurally different from the long-chain fats found in most other oils. Here's where it gets interesting. Because of their shorter molecular structure, MCTs are metabolized differently by the body. Rather than being stored, the way many long-chain fats can be, research indicates MCTs are transported more directly to the liver, where they're often used rapidly for energy or converted into ketones, an alternative fuel source. Some studies suggest MCT consumption may modestly increase energy expenditure and support feelings of fullness compared to other fats. This is a meaningful distinction, because it means not all dietary fat behaves the same way inside the body, something traditional coconut-reliant cultures effectively demonstrated through generations of lived outcomes, long before lipid science existed to explain it. Why did this matter then? In tropical climates with limited food storage options, a stable fat that didn't spoil easily and provided quick, usable energy was invaluable. Why does it matter now? In a modern diet often dominated by highly processed vegetable oils, reintroducing a fat source the body can access and use efficiently offers a meaningful contrast. Traditionally, coconut oil was used unrefined, cold-pressed from mature coconuts, retaining more of its natural compounds than heavily processed versions. That distinction still matters today. Practically, this looks like using a spoonful of unrefined coconut oil for low to medium heat cooking, rather than treating it as a supplement to add indiscriminately to everything. The fat that coastal cultures trusted for centuries wasn't trusted blindly. It was trusted because, meal after meal, it simply worked. Up next is a spice so tied to comfort and warmth that most people never consider its metabolic role at all. Number 9. Cinnamon. Cinnamon has been part of trade history for thousands of years, once valuable enough to be counted among the most sought-after commodities on Earth. But its role went beyond flavor and fragrance. Traditional medicine systems across the Middle East, South Asia, and China used cinnamon specifically for its warming properties and its perceived effect on digestion and internal balance. What research has since uncovered is a specific and fairly well-documented mechanism. Cinnamon, particularly Ceylon cinnamon, contains compounds studied for their potential to improve insulin sensitivity and support healthier blood sugar levels after meals. Some studies suggest cinnamon may help slow the rate at which the stomach empties after eating, producing a more gradual rise in blood sugar rather than a sharp spike. This matters for the same reason acetic acid mattered earlier. Repeated blood sugar spikes place ongoing stress on insulin regulation, and over time, that stress is closely tied to fat storage patterns and metabolic slowdown. A spice that gently supports more stable blood sugar isn't a dramatic fat burner, but it removes one more obstacle standing between the body and efficient metabolic function. But that is only part of the story. Cinnamon has also demonstrated antioxidant properties in research, with some studies suggesting it may help reduce oxidative stress, a factor increasingly linked to metabolic dysfunction and chronic low-grade inflammation. There's an important distinction traditional use didn't need to worry about, but modern use should. Not all cinnamon is the same. Cassia cinnamon, the more common and cheaper variety found in most grocery stores, contains higher levels of a compound called coumarin, which in large amounts may stress the liver. Ceylon cinnamon, sometimes labeled true cinnamon, contains far less traditional medicinal use across South Asia, and Sri Lanka specifically relied on Ceylon varieties, a distinction modern mass-market spice blends have largely erased. Practically, this means seeking out Ceylon cinnamon specifically and using it consistently, rather than the ambiguous cinnamon found in pre-mixed spice jars. A spice once worth its weight in trade value turns out to have been worth something even more valuable: quiet, consistent metabolic support, ounce for ounce. The next food on this list has a much sharper personality, and traditional cultures used it almost like a natural stimulant for the entire metabolic system. Number 10. Mustard seeds. Mustard seeds have a long history in traditional European and South Asian kitchens, often used not just for flavor, but for their sharp, sinus-clearing intensity. Historically, mustard was used in warming preparations, applied for its perceived ability to stimulate circulation and generate internal heat. That instinct, associating mustard with heat and stimulation, turns out to have a measurable biological basis. Mustard seeds contain compounds that have been studied for their potential thermogenic effect, meaning they may modestly increase the rate at which the body burns calories, similar in concept to capsaicin, though through different active compounds. Some research has specifically examined mustard's effect on metabolic rate after consumption, with small studies suggesting a temporary increase in energy expenditure following meals containing mustard seed. The effect size in individual studies tends to be modest, which is worth being honest about. This isn't a food that transforms metabolism on its own, but traditional diets rarely relied on single ingredients in isolation. They relied on consistent patterns, meal after meal, where small effects accumulated over time. What makes mustard particularly interesting historically is how frequently it appeared alongside other thermogenic foods on this list, often paired with vinegar in traditional preparations or used alongside black pepper in preserved dishes. Traditional food pairing, once again, appears to have stacked complementary compounds without any formal understanding of why that combination worked. Mustard seeds are also a source of selenium, a mineral involved in thyroid function. The thyroid gland regulates metabolic rate more directly than almost anything else in the body, and adequate selenium status has been linked in research to healthier thyroid hormone production. This is where things change slightly in how we should think about this list overall. It's not only about compounds that directly burn calories. Some foods matter because they support the systems, like the thyroid, that control metabolic rate at a foundational level. Practically, whole or ground mustard seeds can be used in dressings, pickling brines, or toasted briefly to release their oils before being added to cooked dishes. The seed once used to clear a stuffy head may have been doing quieter work on the body's internal thermostat the entire time. Speaking of the thyroid, the next food on this list is almost entirely built around supporting it, and it comes from a place most modern diets have completely abandoned: the ocean floor. Number 11. Seaweed and kelp. Coastal cultures across Japan, Korea, and parts of Scandinavia built seaweed into daily meals for centuries, not as an occasional garnish, but as a genuine dietary staple. Long before anyone understood endocrine function, these populations experienced notably lower rates of certain deficiency-related conditions common in inland populations eating otherwise similar diets. The explanation, once modern science caught up, was almost embarrassingly simple. Seaweed is one of the richest natural sources of iodine on Earth. And iodine is not optional for metabolism, it's essential. The thyroid gland requires iodine to produce thyroid hormones, and those hormones directly regulate how fast or slow the body's metabolic rate runs. This is the deeper reason this food belongs on the list, and it's different from most other entries. Foods like chili or green tea may offer a modest boost to an already functioning metabolism. Iodine-rich foods like seaweed address something more foundational, whether the thyroid, the actual control system for metabolic rate, has the raw material it needs to function properly at all. Inland populations throughout history often struggled with iodine deficiency, since soil in many inland regions naturally contains less of it, contributing to widespread thyroid-related health issues before iodized salt became common in the 20th century. Coastal cultures avoided much of this simply through proximity to the ocean and consistent seaweed consumption, an advantage they likely never fully understood but clearly benefited from. But here is where it gets interesting for the modern world. While iodized salt has reduced severe deficiency in many regions, mild insufficiency remains surprisingly common, particularly among people who avoid iodized salt or eat heavily processed diets low in naturally iodine-rich foods. A sluggish thyroid, even mildly underperforming, can manifest as fatigue, weight gain, and a metabolism that feels resistant to almost everything else on this list. This is a case where a food isn't flashy or dramatic, yet arguably matters more than several louder entries, because it supports the system controlling the entire process. Traditionally, seaweed was eaten dried, in soups, or wrapped around rice, and those preparation methods remain just as practical today. Dried seaweed snacks, seaweed added to soup broths, or kelp used as a seasoning are realistic, sustainable ways to introduce it without overhauling an entire diet. The vegetable pulled from ocean floors may have been quietly keeping entire coastal populations' metabolic control systems running long before anyone had a word for the gland responsible. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this list isn't about miracle foods, it's about mechanisms, and the next one might be the most misunderstood mechanism of all: what's actually happening inside your gut. Number 12. Fermented foods. Fermentation predates refrigeration by thousands of years, and across nearly every traditional food culture on Earth, some version of it exists. Korean kimchi, German and Eastern European sauerkraut, and countless other regional fermented vegetable dishes weren't created as health trends. They were created out of necessity, as a way to preserve harvests through seasons when fresh food wasn't available. What those cultures couldn't have known is that the fermentation process itself was creating something far more valuable than preservation. Fermented foods are rich in live bacterial cultures, and those cultures interact directly with the gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living in the digestive tract that, research increasingly shows, play a significant role in how efficiently the body processes food, regulates inflammation, and even manages fat storage. This is where things shift dramatically in how we should think about metabolism altogether. For a long time, metabolism was treated as something governed almost entirely by hormones, and calories in, calories out. But a growing body of research points to gut bacterial composition as another major player, one capable of influencing how many calories are extracted from food, how inflammation is regulated throughout the body, and even how hunger signals are communicated to the brain. Some studies have found that individuals with more diverse and balanced gut microbiomes tend to show different metabolic markers compared to those with less diverse gut bacteria, though this remains an active area of ongoing research. What's clearer is that regularly consuming fermented foods appears to support a more favorable and diverse gut bacterial environment. Why did fermentation matter historically? Beyond preservation, traditional diets built around regularly consumed fermented vegetables likely provided a consistent, daily source of beneficial bacteria that modern diets, dominated by pasteurized, shelf-stable, bacteria-free processed foods, largely lack entirely. That contrast is worth sitting with. Store-bought pickles, heated and pasteurized for shelf stability, contain none of the live cultures that traditional fermentation produced. The health value that traditional preservation accidentally created has been engineered out of most modern versions of the same foods, in the name of convenience and shelf life. Practically, this means seeking out genuinely fermented, unpasteurized options, refrigerated kimchi or sauerkraut rather than shelf-stable versions, and incorporating a small serving regularly rather than occasionally. The preserved cabbage, sitting quietly in traditional kitchens for centuries, wasn't just food that lasted longer. It was food that was actively building something inside the people who ate it. The next food on this list isn't plant-based at all, and its story involves one of the most reversed pieces of dietary advice in modern history. Number 13. Eggs. For much of the 20th century, eggs were treated with suspicion, blamed for cholesterol concerns based on research that has since been significantly reconsidered. But long before that suspicion took hold, eggs were treated across nearly every traditional food culture as one of the most complete, valuable sources of nourishment available, cheap, accessible, and relied upon by working households for generations. That traditional trust turns out to be well-founded, and the metabolic reasoning is fairly direct. Eggs are an exceptionally dense source of complete protein, containing all essential amino acids in proportions the body can use efficiently, and protein has a distinct advantage over both carbohydrates and fat when it comes to metabolism. It requires more energy for the body to digest, absorb, and process, a phenomenon known as the thermic effect of food. Research indicates that protein-rich meals can increase calorie expenditure through digestion alone by a meaningfully higher margin than meals dominated by fat or carbohydrates. This isn't a dramatic fat-burning effect, but it's a consistent, reliable one, meal after meal, which compounds over time in a way flashy single-ingredient claims often don't. But that is only part of the story. Protein consumption has also been consistently linked in research to improved satiety, meaning people tend to feel fuller for longer after protein-rich meals, compared to meals of equivalent calories from carbohydrates or fat. This matters enormously for metabolism, because chronic undereating followed by chronic overeating, a cycle poor satiety often produces, tends to disrupt the steady, efficient metabolic function that consistent, satisfying meals support. Eggs also provide choline, a nutrient involved in fat metabolism within the liver. Along with a range of vitamins and minerals, traditional diets relied on eggs to supply consistently and affordably. Why did this matter historically? Working households needed dense, satisfying, affordable nutrition that kept people functioning through physically demanding days. Why does it matter now? In a modern food environment saturated with refined carbohydrates that spike hunger shortly after eating, a return to protein-dense, satiating staples like eggs addresses a problem that didn't exist in the same way historically. Practically, this looks like treating eggs as a genuine meal component rather than an occasional side dish, prepared simply, the way traditional households did out of necessity rather than trend. The food that spent decades wrongly accused turns out to have been one of the most quietly reliable metabolic allies in the traditional diet the entire time. Next on this list is a category of food that traditional cultures ate almost daily, and modern diets have nearly abandoned entirely. Number 14. Legumes and lentils. Legumes don't have a dramatic story. There's no exotic origin, no rare trade route, no ceremonial history. Beans, lentils, and chickpeas were simply staple foods across nearly every traditional agricultural civilization, from the Mediterranean to South Asia to the Americas, because they were affordable, storable, and reliably nourishing. That lack of drama is exactly why legumes tend to get overlooked in conversations about metabolism, buried under flashier ingredients with more interesting backstories. But the biological case for legumes is arguably stronger and more consistent than several louder entries on this list. Legumes are unusually rich in soluble fiber, a type of fiber that slows digestion and the absorption of sugar into the bloodstream. Research consistently shows that high-fiber meals produce a more gradual blood sugar response compared to low-fiber, refined carbohydrate meals, which, as covered earlier with cinnamon and vinegar, has direct implications for insulin regulation and fat storage patterns. But here's where it gets interesting. That same fiber also feeds beneficial gut bacteria, functioning as what researchers call a prebiotic. This connects directly back to the gut microbiome discussion from fermented foods. Legumes don't introduce new bacteria the way fermented foods do, but they feed and support the bacteria already present, which some research suggests may enhance the benefits of a diverse gut microbiome even further. Legumes also combine fiber with a meaningful amount of plant-based protein, giving them a dual advantage. the satiety benefits associated with protein discussed with eggs, alongside the blood sugar stability benefits of fiber. Few whole foods offer that particular combination as efficiently or affordably. Historically, this made legumes an ideal staple for populations who needed sustained energy through long working days without access to constant food availability. A pot of lentils could provide steady, slow-releasing energy across an entire day of physical labor, something refined, modern convenience foods, despite far greater caloric density, often fail to replicate due to the speed at which they digest and spike blood sugar. This is the quiet thread running through this entire list. It was never really about foods that burn fat aggressively. It was about foods that kept the body's systems, blood sugar, digestion, gut bacteria, and hormone regulation, working the way they were designed to function. Practically, incorporating lentils, chickpeas, or beans several times a week, in soups, stews, or as a side, mirrors exactly how traditional diets used them, consistently, affordably, without needing to think about it as a strategy at all. The staple that fed civilizations without ever needing a reputation turns out to be one of the most metabolically sound foods on this entire list. And now, the final food on this list, the one hiding in plain sight in almost every kitchen on Earth, and the one most people have never once considered in the context of metabolism at all. Number 15. Cacao. Long before chocolate became a sugar-laden dessert, cacao held a position of genuine reverence in Mesoamerican cultures, prepared as a bitter, unsweetened drink, and valued highly enough to be used as currency in some periods. It was consumed deliberately, not casually, often associated with energy, vitality, and ceremonial importance. What those cultures were drinking bears almost no resemblance to modern chocolate. Raw cacao is intensely bitter, rich in flavonols, a class of antioxidant compounds that has become one of the more well-studied areas in nutritional research over the past 2 decades. Research suggests cacao flavonols may support healthy blood flow and circulation, and some studies indicate a potential relationship between flavonol intake and improved metabolic markers, including how the body responds to blood sugar. Cacao also naturally contains small amounts of stimulating compounds, including theobromine, which produces a gentler, more sustained energizing effect compared to the sharper spike associated with caffeine. Traditional Mesoamerican use, often before physical activity or ceremonial exertion, aligns closely with what these compounds appear to support. But here is the contrast that matters most on this entire list. What traditional cultures consumed, and what most people consume today when they think of chocolate, are barely related products. Modern commercial chocolate is often dominated by sugar and processed milk fat, with cacao content diluted to a small fraction of the bar, and the flavonol content significantly reduced through processing methods designed to remove bitterness rather than preserve compounds. This is, in many ways, the perfect closing example for everything this list has been building toward. The original food had real, traditionally observed, and increasingly research-supported value. What the modern world did was take that food, strip out the parts responsible for its actual function, and replace them with sugar and convenience, marketing the result under the same name. Practically, this means seeking out raw cacao, or dark chocolate, with a high cacao percentage, ideally 70% or above, with minimal added sugar, rather than the confectionery version most people associate with the word chocolate. The seed, once treated as sacred currency, was never really about indulgence. It was about a specific, deliberate use case that modern convenience has almost entirely erased. And, with that, we've reached the end of the list. But the real takeaway isn't any single food on it. What connects all 15 of these foods isn't a hidden fat-burning trick nobody wants you to know about. It's something quieter and, honestly, more useful than that. Every single food on this list earned its place in traditional diets through generations of lived observation, refined slowly, without labs, without studies, without anyone fully understanding the mechanisms involved. And what's genuinely remarkable is how often modern research, decades or centuries later, arrives at explanations that validate exactly what traditional cultures had already figured out through nothing but attention and repetition. That's the real reframe worth sitting with. Ancient people were not primitive. They were observant, in a way that modern convenience has slowly trained us out of. They didn't have the language of thermogenesis, insulin sensitivity, or gut microbiome diversity, but they had something arguably more valuable: patience, consistency, and enough generational continuity to notice what actually worked over time. Modern life moved fast enough to forget most of it. Processed convenience replaced fermented preservation, refined sugar replaced bitter cacao, pre-ground spice replaced fresh preparation, and somewhere in that shift, a lot of quiet, functional wisdom got left behind, not because it stopped working, but because it stopped being convenient. None of these 15 foods are magic. None of them will replace consistent movement, adequate sleep, or overall dietary quality, and anyone claiming a single ingredient can override those fundamentals isn't being honest with you. But layered together, prepared the way traditional cultures actually prepared them, these foods represent a return to something the modern food system has systematically stripped away: function over convenience, substance over shelf life, pattern over trend. So here's the challenge. Don't try to add all 15 of these at once. Pick one, maybe two, the ones that surprised you most, and actually change how you prepare or use them this week. Notice what happens, not overnight, but over the following weeks, the way traditional cultures notice things, slowly, consistently, through real attention rather than a quick before and after. We want to know which one surprised you the most. Was it the ceremony behind green tea, the accidental science behind curry spice pairing, or the ocean vegetable feeding an organ most people never think about? Drop it in the comments, because the conversation there is often more interesting than the video itself. And if uncovering forgotten, functional wisdom like this is something you want more of, subscribe, because there's an entire history of overlooked knowledge still waiting to be unpacked. And next time, we're going somewhere even more surprising.